Everybody ready? Fantastic, fantastic. So, welcome everybody to the June Designing in Color panel, the Model Minority Myth. We have today 7 incredible panelists, all welcome to discuss, unpack, unbuild, and just educate all of us on this really complex issue in design and really all of the social political spectrum. We're so happy to have everybody here with us today. If you didn't know, Designing in Color is a collective of architects and designers of culture whose mission aims to diversify the way architecture is taught and practiced, all to amplify marginalized communities. Along with workshops in socially responsible design, we also hold regular panels like the one you'll be seeing tonight. So welcome once more. Our panelists tonight are Bees Zhang, they, she pronouns, a designer, artist, organizer, and educator based on Tongva Land, Los Angeles, USA. They are a founding member of Space Industries and an organizer with the Design as Protest Collective and Dark Matter University. Recently, they taught at the California College of the Arts, University of Michigan, and University at Buffalo. Welcome, Bees. Next, we have Christin Hu, they, she pronouns. Christin is a queer, non-binary writer, urban farmer, and designer who creates joyful learning with data visualization, ecology, and games. Awesome. They currently work as a freelance consultant, organized within the Design as Protest Collective, and edit content for failed architecture. Welcome, Christin. We have here Edson G. Cabalfin, PhD, he, him pronouns. Edson is an educator, architect, designer, researcher, and historian. He's the inaugural Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the School of Architecture at Tulane University. Edson's research is focused on the interdisciplinary intersections of architecture, post-colonial theory, spatial justice, and conservation, as well as culture, gender, and sexuality studies. That's incredible. Welcome, Edson. We have here also Seema Kairam, her, she pronouns. Seema is a licensed architect as well as an associate and design lead at Able City, an architecture and planning firm in South Texas. Seema is passionate about inclusive design, designing just built environments that improve quality of life and encourage historically marginalized communities to thrive. She's a member of the Association for Community Design and the Design as Protest Collective. Welcome, 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 Seema. Aditya Ghosh is an architect at FX Collaborative and director at the Build Out Alliance, which he describes as, quote, an organic coming together of professionals based on a need for such an organization in our industry. I am here to be one of many driven individuals who have created a free and safe space for themselves at their workplace and hope to enable others to do the same. But he really prefers to see himself as a storyteller, where the city is a setting for experiences, intentions, and purpose. Welcome, Aditya. Now we have Navi here, she, her pronouns, an architectural designer and urban planner passionate about centering the voices of impacted communities, demystifying urban design, and storytelling. In her current role with Thrivance Group, she focuses on dignity-infused community engagement, housing justice, and the early stages of a comprehensive package for reparations through urbanism. Very, very cool. Navi is a core organizer with the Design as Protest Collective, as well as the Defund CPD campaign. Welcome, Navi. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Crisman, he, him pronouns, an artist and urban scholar whose work considers the intersections between culture, politics, and place. He recently published Urban Humanities, New Practices for Reimagining the City. Congratulations, go buy it right now. And is an assistant professor of public and applied humanities at the University of Arizona. He holds degrees in architecture, geography, and urban planning from USC, MIT, and UCLA. What an incredible, incredible panel. Welcome, everyone. Everyone who's watching at home, you know, finger snaps, whatever you do, celebrate them. Sprinkle us with emojis. This is like so much talent here right now. I'm so happy to have everybody here. Thank you. I see some emojis. That's great. And of course, before we begin, huge thank you to Alvin Huang of Synthesis Design and Architecture and A.L. Hu of Queries.xyz and Design as Protest for their indispensable efforts in putting together this panel, getting me in contact with all these amazing people. So thank you so much to both of you. Now, let's dive right in. For each section, I'm going to kind of highlight a few panelists to begin responding, but of course it's open to all of our panelists. So the first question, I want Edson, Seema, Christin, and Aditya to give it a shot. When did you realize that in this country you might be considered AAPI? And what does the model minority myth mean to you?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Rubin, and also the entire team of Designing in Color for having this great panel. Realizing when I was AAPI, I'd never thought of it before I first came to the US. I was born and raised in Manila, the Philippines. And so I always thought that, oh, I was just Filipino and I was Asian until I came here, that then I was suddenly categorized, that I had to tick a box as part of demographics. And then I think later on, this perception of a distinct group or a category was even strengthened when I went to Cornell when I was doing my PhD, because then at that point, Cornell also had a very strong Asian studies program. And so the discussions about Asian American identity was very much apparent. And of course, like it was discussed everywhere on campus. And then also, I think it also became even more kind of poignant for me when I became the president of Cornell Filipino Association at that time, which then this sort of intersection between the different identities amongst the Asian American Pacific Islander community was also something that was very evident at that time. So, kind of like these multiple moments in time. But first coming to the US was something that was very much a point of departure for my consciousness of being AAPI.
I can go next. So I think AAPI, at least realizing that I am AAPI, came just very recently and completely had to do with solidarity with the Asian community, Asian Pacific Islander community in what we're undergoing now. But in terms of what the model minority myth means, I'll just go back to a little bit because it's every time I talk about being part of the minority, it's I'm automatically grouped in with the South Asian community, and so I have to every time delineate that there's a difference between an American Indian individual and me, because I moved here in 2011, which meant that I grew up in a post-colonial society rather than colonial society. But that also meant that there was a huge difference in how I perceived whiteness, and it was bolstered by like a misplaced cultural influence of coming in from the US and UK, but also it kind of formed how I perceive people of color. So it's common for many of us from Southeast Asia to realize with a jolt that we are not aligned with the lighter end of the spectrum of race. And many still refuse to confront that notion, thanks to delineations of economics or the carceral system. So who is legal and who is not, or what is considered legal and what is not. And a lot of people go by those and see themselves differently till someone points out that if you're brown or black, then you're an immigrant and not an expat. And that takes a while to sink in for those who try to think about it. So when you're thinking about the diaspora, there's always a perceived or projected identity of displacement, whether real or not. And I always saw myself as a replacement. So my ambitions, or who I'm on paper, is legally a resident alien. So what that means is that after 1965, only skilled labor was allowed from India. And so my employers were compelled to prove that I was the only person for the job to get me to a visa to stay here. And that support, fortunately for me, was unconditional. For a lot of people, it's not. But it really does create a definition that I had to unlearn because we are moving here believing that we are model professionals, an alien who does as a model citizen should do. And so in a way, the idea of the model minority, I think, is even more pronounced. It was for me even more pronounced in my mind as a reality that I had to slowly shed over years.
Yeah, I can hop in next. I feel like I've already changed what I was planning on saying, but just, I mean, it's interesting, hearing Edson and Aditya, like, they talk about their experiences being, immigrants that came to this country, whereas I am first generation. And so it's sort of like, their experience is more similar to my parents. And, I am sort of dealing with like how they interpret like what it means to come to this country. So my parents like really tried very hard to assimilate. So I sort of like, they spoke English to each other even in India before they immigrated here. Like I didn't learn, like they never taught me my sort of native tongue. And so like, I feel like that sort of disconnect or disjoint, like that fracture, like gets bigger potentially, or has in my experience, being that kind of next generation. So yeah, I mean, maybe to go back, I'm going to go back to the original question of sort of when I first I understood my identity as AAPI was actually like really recently. I can like pinpoint the moment. It was in 2019. I've been on this sort of like professional shift of really trying to like go from like a traditional practice of architecture towards a practice that really like thinks about how to make a more equitable built environment and what does that practice look like. And through that process, it's a long story, but it led me in 2019 to participate in a conference called The People of the Global Majority in the Outdoors, Nature, and Environment. And it was the first time that I ever participated in a affinity group. So it was like a room full of 100 folks who were all AAPI. And honestly, like there were more differences amongst that group than there were similarities. It was, there were many different ethnicities, people from different class backgrounds, people from different geographies, different immigration statuses. But being in that room, I sort of realized the power of that solidarity. And especially when you layer it in with an Sorry.
Okay.
I think I got muted. Maybe I'm talking too long.
No. Please keep going. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aditya was sort of saying this too, that like there's a conversation about the AAPI community, and then there's one that's different when you mix in equity and like what that means when you're trying to have a conversation about, equity and having solidarity across race. And so that's, I'll stop there, but.
Yeah, I think to kind of hop off on some of what Seema had mentioned about, at least for my parents as well, we're also very much trying to assimilate. So my mom came over in the 80s, post 1965 Immigration Act. And so it's, I think for me, like AAPI wasn't really a thing until maybe I saw it on like these like surveys or like standardized tests, when you have to like check things as well. And even then, for the most part, like I think I connected more with American-born Chinese ABC as a way to kind of like identify myself rather than even Asian American or Chinese American. And I think like when I first began to notice like my Asianness or being a little bit conscious of it, or even in with some kind of exposure to the behaviors associated with like model minority myth, like those stories, was maybe in middle school, where I started to hear from my peers that I'm Asian and, oh, of course you got a high score because you're Asian, and that it's a compliment, and, noticing that there are people who look like me, mostly actually like particularly like femme presenting students were kind of like all hung out together. And it was kind of like an interesting dynamic, I think, as a middle school student to kind of see that come out. And I think, you know, as we're talking about the model minority myth, like for me, and also doing some like reading of what's being said now and also since earlier, is that the model minority myth to me seems like this, it's a myth, it's a story, but it's crafted, so it's a story, so there is some truth to it. Like, so I think earlier, right, there's some mention of how it might be, you know, it's not really a myth because there are certain instances or phenomenon, you know, it's not to say that there aren't kind of like bits of it that are kind of like visible and that are actually true, but that it's a story told from this outside white male colonial gaze, right? This William Peterson guy, sociologist, and also a number of other reports that kind of has been sensationalized and manipulated to justify violence and erasure of the kind of much more diverse communities. So yeah, I'll stop there.
just to what Christin said about the story, I remember very clearly making a distinction that when that story is being said about a minority, it's always comparative and not competitive. So you're not being seen as competing with the non-minority, let's say. It's just you're being compared to the other minorities and being seen as a model among them. So there's always that hard line, and that makes the fact that a story is being told by someone other than us, that makes it even more interesting.
That's such a great point. And you're right. It seems like white supremacy is based off that kind of harsh comparison, wherein you are a model minority because you are not them. You've exceeded, like the Peterson article from 1966 is so weird because it acknowledges systemic racism, and then it says specifically Japanese Americans are model minorities because in spite of it, they succeeded, and that's really cool. And it was so weird. It's like, there's a problem, but you did well, so that's pretty great. But the other races are terrible at solving this problem that we created. It's really weird. It's fascinating to me too. But I would like to open the floor up to the other panelists. Would any of you like to respond to when you realized you were AAPI in this country, or what the myth means to you as well?
Well, I'll just jump in and say, yeah, it's a complete hypocrisy to create an entire story to say racism and anti-Black racism in particular doesn't exist or isn't a problem by being racist and lumping in a bunch of other people under a racialization. And so I'll just add, you know, I'm just sort of adding that, you know, as the question for me is always like, who and what systems does something serve? And in this case, it serves white supremacy in creating, right, through immigration, restrictive immigration, and then maintaining a racial caste system.
I think one other thing, you know, on the idea of like storytelling and myth, I think it's important to point out that racialized storytelling, you'll notice that there are no individual names, right? It's like an entire group of people rather than an individual. And what that ultimately does is sort of, you know, kind of homogenize this super diverse group of people with diverse experiences, different needs, different capabilities into like a single uniform entity. You know, it dehumanizes those people. And so, you know, I think storytelling is really powerful, but, you know, no matter what the context, if it's the model minority myth or other forms of racialized storytelling, I think you have to be very cautious and careful whenever you come across a story that is like sort of, weirdly kind of like non-humanized. It's, so I right now, my background's in architecture and planning, but right now I teach in a college of humanities. And I think that's one of the sort of stories we say about the humanities, for better or for worse. I think it has its own faults, but I think one strength of the humanities is that there is an insistence on the particular and the individual over the kind of like universal or the, the kind of the general. And I think getting to that kind of level of specificity is more specificity is always better. I think part of the problem with something like the model minority myth, I mean, I'm still talking in generalities, even when I say the following, but one common thing that's pointed out is that it lumps together kind of all AAPI people, despite there being very clear statistical evidence showing very, very different socioeconomic experiences for particular ethnic groups in the United States. So, East Asians, and the model minority myth kind of originated with Japanese Americans, are often kind of assumed to be representative of all AAPI people, but that's simply not true. South Asian folks in particular, many of whom fled war as refugees because of, the US invasion in Vietnam, have a very set of different circumstances and socioeconomic conditions. Not to mention, I think even the term AAPI, we're always trying to be more inclusive, which is good, and like adding more letters. But at the same time, I think there's a little bit of a kind of a problematic in terms of lumping in PI or Pacific Islander with Asian American. And that's in large part because there's a very different experience, going back to some of the discussions around, colonialism and so forth. And indigeneity, there's a very different experience with regard to that. So I think Christin really hit the nail on the head, in terms of saying, defining it as this kind of active storytelling, which is very powerful, but also, a dangerous tool and very problematic as well.
I'm so happy you brought up AAPI, especially. First of all, I think it's so interesting that in such an individualistic society, like the act of generalization seems especially insidious. We always think about ourselves individually, but we just generalize the other. And that's really dangerous. But specifically on Asian American, the term, for the context for the audience, the term is believed to have been coined in 1968 by Asian American grad students to kind of unify the incredibly diverse range of people of Asian descent on campus for social activism, basically. And it wasn't until the 1980s that the US Census sort of lumped in Pacific Islanders and made this giant umbrella term AAPI. So I want to pitch this next question to Jonathan Bees and Navi. Can each of you describe how the phrase AAPI has evolved as a tool for organizing and activism?
I mean, I appreciate you giving that little like bit of history. I think it's really valuable to remember that Asian American didn't originate as like a Census Bureau term or like a racial marker, but actually an intentionally kind of self-generated marker of kind of a shared political consciousness. It was basically a naming device used as a tool for political activism. And I think, it's tricky because you can say the same term and mean very different things depending on context and who's saying it and all of that. But I think if we think about these markers of identity as political tools of political solidarity with one another, rather than some kind of like essence that captures our identity, I think it's a lot more valuable. I mean, speaking as a queer person as well, I think that's part of the beauty of the term queer, is that it like intentionally kind of doesn't mean anything too specific and can kind of capture a lot of different kinds of experience. And I think that what's underlying that is really that it's a political term more than like a clearly defined marker of one's own personal identity. And then the one other thing I kind of wanted to mention Well, okay, so two things. Sorry, I'm like talking a lot. But one thing is I just wanted to point back at Edson's comment earlier about this sort of like, you know, kind of Asian American realization happening in the context of college. I think that schools and spaces of learning are these spaces where we can kind of like break off at least a little bit from, you know, the sort of status quo in society and like reflect a little bit. There's a little bit more time and space to you know, kind of have conversations with one another, take action. And historically and today, always, it's been students who've really driven a lot of the change that's been happening. And so I think it's totally apt that Asian American, you know, the term actually comes out of a couple of students from Berkeley, you know, in this larger kind of Asian American movement that's happening in '68 with student movement, civil rights movement, et cetera, that comes out of that. And well, I'll stop there. I have other things to say, but I'll pass it off. I feel like I'm talking too much.
You're not talking too much. That was beautiful. And I'm just like sitting with all these like reflections. And I love what you said about using queer instead of, I use queer instead of gay because I know it's political. And I say South Asian instead of Indian, since like learning about where India came from in college for a reason, because it's also political. Someone arbitrarily drew that line to decide where India is and where Pakistan is and where all these divisions occurred. And that's happened throughout all of Asia, right? And using terms like Asian American, I feel like it helps build that solidarity with other folks to know, like, can we talk about our collective struggles? And as a first generation immigrant, I know that there are certain stories that my grandparents, my parents, other relatives who moved here earlier just don't share. Because of all the trauma that comes with colonialism, imperialism, and it's a safety thing, right? You assimilate because you came here for safety so that the same systems of harm that you had to suffer through are not inflicted upon your children and grandchildren. And we're here because our ancestors struggled. So we're here because they did all the work, and now we're continuing that link in that chain for resistance. And I've been reading this really dope book, y'all. It's called As We Have Always Done, which I highly recommend, about Indigenous resistance. So some of the language I'm using now is like coming from like what I just read this morning. But I see this like the self-naming and reclaiming of terms and storytelling, like Jonathan and Christin were talking about, as a tool for solidarity and learning about resistance movements and reclaiming some of the things that have been lost, like language, culture, strategies, just to really like fuck things up in a good way and make sure that the systems of harm that have been perpetrated for centuries do not continue this really just insidious grasp and like strangle on our lives. I'll stop there and pass it to Bees.
Thank you. Jonathan and Navi are taking the words out of my mouth. I love the question, Rubin, that you pose as well with the word tool, because it is a tool. All words are tools. So and names are tools. So what solidarities does this tool help us build? What histories does it help us recognize? And what futures does this tool help us imagine? So I can actually I really like am moved thinking about that time in the 60s of all of this organizing by Black and Indigenous and Latinx student organizers and these Asian Americans whose communities have historically been pitted against each other and exploited as cheap labor, so that Japanese and Chinese and Filipino and Native Hawaiian workers are paid different amounts or housed separately in order to like foster tensions between these communities, right? And between other communities of color as well. So to actually say, we're experiencing the same kind of imperial and colonial systems is so moving to me, actually. But at the same time, it's been co-opted in a lot of ways and diluted, this phrase, Asian American, over time, and doesn't quite, I can't say that it serves to build the solidarities or imagine the futures that I think I am personally invested in at this time. So I rarely use that phrase. For that reason. And I think that that's a huge kind of reflection that I think a lot of us are sitting with, is like, all right, so first of all, let's not be afraid to notice that and to identify other words. I do think, I really also appreciate bringing in queerness and queer theory as well, because I think that queer people are so adept at this kind of fluidity and navigating and moving between labels and finding new homes for ourselves. So I'll stop there as well. I would love to hear more folks on the panel.
To see those transitions in people that have.
I love these responses so far. I want to open up the question to our other panelists if they would like to chime in as well.
Can I also add the notion also as another layer when Navi was also mentioning about like South Asia, like, you know, as a term different, let's say with AAPI, we need to also remember how also to come back also and relate to what Jonathan was mentioning earlier about colleges, you know, the notion of Asian studies as emerging after the Cold War, and how, for example, the US had purposely also kind of like for their convenience split up Asia into South Asia, Southeast Asia, you know, North Asia, East Asia, which seems to be like a good alternative, seemingly a good alternative, let's say, to the more archaic terms of Far East, Middle East, right? And yet, however, it also poses more problematics because it also, again, erases the kinds of differences between the different identities, ethnicities, and cultures, even within those different regions, you know, regions of Asia. So you know, emerging during the Cold War, and it's still present, you know, and that's why like you still see these departments of like, you know, Asian studies with like all of these sort of like subcategories, and I also don't know at the moment in terms of like what could we change it with, but just to show also about the complicated history of these terms, of how the terminology has so much power. And so I think it really, you know, we need to rethink again, what could that be in the future? I don't have any answer at the moment, but it kind of also dovetails with AAPI because it's part of the larger narrative of kind of like regional distinction and categorization that emerged with language, you know, and teaching languages like by the Department of State, so that then they can basically infiltrate and understand the local cultures, by which then the US would then extend their power, right, and privilege. And so again, it's just as others have said, you know, the longer intertwined relationship with imperialism and colonialism is still evident in those terms.
And I love that response too. I love the discussion on naming, especially. I think back to a Studio Ghibli film called Earthsea, where a character's like there's magic in someone's name, so everyone goes by an alias, and it's not until you express your name that your power is taken away. And I think that's such an interesting parallel to how we're discussing it, and I apologize for the nerdy aside. I can't help myself. But based off that mention of erasure, I wanted to ask, how has the AAPI community worked against the erasure of identity that the umbrella term brings?
I mean, I can hop in quickly and just plug again infinitely for data disaggregation. I think that's been a really like committed, kind of dispersed but stubborn movement and set of movements that's been happening, you know, and Jonathan and others have kind of alluded to it already. But you know, there's really it's not really, AAPI doesn't even feel like an umbrella at this point. It's like a dam that's about to burst. It does nothing to help give our communities the resources, our communities, plural, the resources that we differently need or have, right? So there's not just like East Asians are often overrepresented in certain fields, or often more financially privileged or paid higher than other POC. But also within even one community like Chinese Americans, there's that kind of data needs to be disaggregated a little bit further, because for folks who are newer immigrants, often coming as students, versus our elders who are working class in Chinatown, like that data also needs to be kind of examined and taken apart, because there's so much kind of intentional elevating of this like crazy rich Asians thing, which really means crazy rich East Asians, and that for like that's the 2020 version of the model minority myth in a lot of ways, to say actually everyone's fine. It's not, and they can be stupid, but they're rich and everyone's okay, right? So that would be a huge one, and affirmative action would be another area of that relates to data disaggregation. But I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think for sure, like also just hopping on that, even within like the Chinese American community, like just talking about the disaggregation, there's just such a huge difference. And then there's the reasoning behind that as well, because of the group of Chinese laborers who arrived, before the Exclusion Act, and then also the kind of loosening of those in the 1940s and 50s, and so there was a period. There's a reasoning in a way, like in the kind of foreign relations and imperialism that the U.S. Was carrying out in China, as well, and also, Southeast Asia and the Pacific Island, like Hawaii, Guam. There's, I think that for using the kind of, I don't know, working against the erasure. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm not super familiar with the use of AAPI to kind of forward, like using that particular term to forward or work against the erasure. What I do think is helpful is actually listening to the individual stories and identities of people that have experienced their very different experiences, because even in reading of the history that is very specific to Chinese Americans, actually, I'm seeing that my personal story is very different. It's related, right? And it's important to understand my story in the context of all these other stories, but it's also just like, that's okay, I can see where that relates, but also like, this is not quite right. And I don't know if that sits right with me. And so it's like, I think, I would say using storytelling as, with Instagram Reels and everything, I've been seeing lots of like individual stories and quotes and Twitter threads, and I think that like those modes and the actual expressions of those stories and visibility of those stories are what really forward against the erasure rather than like the use of the term.
That's a really beautiful sentiment. Narrative wins over everything, ultimately. I love that. I want to kind of shift the conversation to model minority myth in design specifically. And for this section, I want to highlight Aditya, Bees, and Seema. Where do we see the vernacular AAPI design in architecture, and how has it been subsumed under other styles or the work of starchitects?
Should I go first? Well, so I think if we go through the pipeline, education, architectural education, let's say design education, but more particularly architecture education, is still tied to a very traditional structure. Even in India, we were taught that Indian architecture is history, it's historic, whereas modern is Western. That comes in all aspects of a post-colonial society, because technological inequality is seen as ambition. So building a glass building in Delhi is seen as progressive, is seen as modern, even though that's changing now. I'm generalizing, but in a way that equipped a lot of us as architects to, in a way, learn how to code switch our design aesthetic, our opinions of what is good design. And we gave into, I hate the term taste levels, because the word taste levels is a hegemony where when you say that someone meets your taste levels, it means they're part of the part of the design canon. And that's a very subjective term that is suddenly made very much a trait of a successful architect or a designer. So I've mentioned this earlier. What we're doing is in a homogeneous design environment where it's everything you design is seen as universal, regardless of any individual or even societal differences, then we are all passing in a way as inherently synchronized with the trends of the industry set largely by white consumers, largely by a very traditional workflow between the designer and let's say the real estate company and the eventual occupant. So that's the problem. My personal understanding of how, because we have a lot of conversations in my firm about how design reflects who we are, where as individuals, if we are trying to navigate a dual identity of being here and being, let's say, AAPI, so shouldn't the surrounding should reflect it. And my personal, not a solution, but way to study that, which a lot of people is doing is, and I'll bring up queer theory again, because the basis of queer theory is that when you have a marginalized community and you place them in an infrastructure that has not thought of them, they find ways to subvert and create their own spaces within that grid, so to speak. And so studying those very mechanisms with the, let's say, the population of undocumented people who are trying to make a living in the city, or any other that kind, sort of placemaking, the principles are the same. You're not being given a place by the designer, and so you're creating your own space. And I think there's something to learn from that in developing what I still think doesn't exist, which is a way of designing by inclusion rather than designing universally, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I can add on some more bullet points to this conversation. We had like a prep meeting and all of us were like, oh my God, this could be 20 conversations. I think something that frustrates me and probably a lot of people on this call is, when we bring up issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, et cetera, that in our field, in built environment disciplines, it becomes like, okay, now this is social design, or now we're talking about a social issue. Now we're not talking about design. So some of the things points I might add to this are sort of, not only, our everything that Aditya has brought to the table, but there are imprints of imperialism, Western imperialism in Asia, in all of the vernacular architecture that we see in this country and in the West today. So I, today in Los Angeles, live in a California bungalow, which is derived from a Bengali vernacular form that was kind of distorted by British military engineers to become this kind of housing style for military officers in colonial India, and then brought over through the arts and crafts movement back to the UK, over to the US, and then sort of expanded as this suburban white American middle class dream. So, even today, I can point to a history that has impacted the way that my family has moved through the world. And I think that ties back into what we've been discussing so far about needing to tell the stories of our own diasporas and communities and not derive them or receive them from a nation state or imperial state. The end kind of thing, right? So to tell our own versions of who we are and where we come from and what influences us, and because the other aspect of Asian American as a term that becomes a problem, it was not part of the intention, is kind of affirms the imperial boundaries of the United States. So it's saying like, and assimilation in general, you know, of saying like, once you get here, leave everything else at the door, at the border. And now you have to come up with what is AAPI now that you're here, right? Where actually that thread is not broken. I mean, there are attempts, systemic and at a local level, to break them, but those threads continue, and we actually see that in our architecture. We see that, you know, I think people are more like it's more noticeable sometimes in something like food, or, you know, an area like food or film or movies, or, you know, we even talk about it in fine art at this point. But just as like the influx of Japanese wood cuts and what we would call chinoiserie into Western Europe influenced Impressionism and abstraction, we see that, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright openly admitted that, you know, he saw the Japanese pavilion at the Chicago World Fair in 1893, where Asian people, Black and brown people, indigenous people were on display, as well as architecture. And then he went on to develop the prairie style from there. Alvar Aalto used paper lamps, straw mats, you know, motifs that were also derived from Japanese and East Asian architecture and art that was being kind of discovered, quote unquote, at the time, you know, and even the California modernism kind of derives from East Asian and South Asian architecture. So I won't go on and on about that. That's sort of like my soapbox, but, you know, it's like, it's dripping. Our discipline is like dripping with it, you know.
If I could jump in, you know, this is just like, I totally love you dropping all this knowledge, because it's so fascinating. And it just makes me think about how, and Aditya, what you were saying about, you know, like modern/Western that has this like embedded, like there's this sort of subconscious feeling in a lot of places in the world that it's somehow better. And, you know, something that I've been sort of starting to research and try and think about, I think is related, which is, I think there, especially with sort of younger generations of diasporic kind of offspring, I think are reclaiming a lot of these things that have been rejected, you know, in part for reasons of safety and, you know, kind of legitimate concerns by older generations. And in part, I think there's a kind of baked in, I don't know if self-hatred is maybe too strong of a word, but the sense that like, oh, we need to like throw out all of that the old ways and kind of adapt to this like new American whatever. And, you know, even Seema, what you were saying earlier about language and speaking English at home, you know, I think many of us have this experience. I certainly have this experience of like not being taught Korean because I was supposed to be the good American boy and focus on English. And I, you know, I've observed, you know, I think these, like you were saying, certainly in food and in other areas of culture, that a kind of, I'd say, a younger generation is less afraid of claiming that heritage and is more willing to not accept, you know, sort of heritage or culture as something that's static and fixed. That there isn't a sense that we need to return to some mythic ideal, but that we're living it and we can create it and we can draw on those influences and celebrate a new kind of approach of integrating our experience, which is sort of at this crossroads. I think it's super exciting, and you know, it's probably in part because of my own ignorance, but I'm not as familiar with as many people doing that kind of thing within design and architecture, and I think it's a really important kind of cultural undertaking and something that I'm sure folks like these and others will take on. It's super exciting. Oh, and sorry, one other kind of pin that I wanted to stick in what Bees was saying was that historically, you know, like a lot of the people who have kind of co-opted like other cultures, you know, are these sort of empowered white kind of colonial figures. And basically they have the capacity to do that because they are empowered as such to do so, to take and kind of like dominate. And so I think it's no coincidence that most of these figures who have you know borrowed from this sort of global array of culture have been people who, certainly were intelligent and could identify, wow, this is something very special, but also were in a position where they could borrow and take and use for their own design in a way that folks from those cultures or other places couldn't do. So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go.
Oh, I don't have a ton to say about this topic. My first reaction to the question was like, I feel so inequipped to like even answer it because like I didn't learn the vernacular AAPI architecture, if there is one. And, first of all, like shout out to Bees and like Dark Matter University and like this attempt to like rewrite the canon and to like learn and understand like all that we as a community and other communities of color bring to the design practice. So like I've been so inspired by the work of DMU and just like wanna like, that was amazing. And I just have so much respect for you and the work that DMU is doing. And then I think also just like questioning that idea that like as architects that we have to bring our identity to the work that we do. Like that, I think even like the idea of a star architect is like a white supremacist idea. And that like, we, like flipping that and thinking about like, well, what community are you working for and working with? And having your design respond to that. That's something that like I've been really like thinking a lot in the last couple of months because I've started working with a firm that, like 80% folks of like Mexican heritage. Like we do our work on the border and it's like, most of our office speaks Spanish most of the day, which has been a really incredible experience for me of like unlearning, like they haven't learned the sort of like white like norms in the design practice. And like, I have to like always check myself and like make sure that I'm unlearning those practices too, because that was my design education and like my experience thus far. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experience, like being in a space where like that's not like an architectural and design space where that's not the ground that we're all standing on.
I'd like to add to B's comment also earlier, and to kind of link it back to also the idea of the star architects, because it really reminded me of this example, like the Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi by Jean Nouvel, and how he appropriated the Marshabiyya, the pier screen that you find in a lot of cultures in the Middle East. And this particularly is, from the United Arab Emirates. And it struck me because of how prior to coming back to the US, I was with a firm and we were designing in the Middle East and our client and in other parts of UAE. And the discussion has always been about exactly about this idea of, do you appropriate the vernacular architecture of the region? But none of the discussion really really focused on this relationship between who is being appropriated and who is appropriating, right? And so the power dynamics, and again, to use the Jean Nouvel example, right? Jean Nouvel is a French architect who's appropriating that of an Emirati and Middle Eastern screen, and then applying it, to the museum. But then if you look at, let's say, the Emirati architects, somehow they're being dismissed by using the same ideas from their own culture. And why is it that Jean Nouvel, a French architect, is allowed to do that and sort of celebrated, and yet, an Emirati architect who does the same thing is actually dismissed, right? So, and we see that in many different examples in the contemporary world. And as Bees is pointing out, historically it's been so long, and it still is happening today. And I think the question, and that's why, like for me, what strikes me is the power relationship, and then who's who's able to appropriate or able to use some of these vernacular design elements, and then who is allowed and who is not allowed to use them. And that's something that is very complicated as well, right? Because it also varies from who is doing what and from whom are they borrowing or appropriating or co-opting.